Hello, thank you for joining us today on our critical data security considerations for cross-region merger and acquisitions. Today, this is going to be part one of 3 series on this topic. And a lot of what's driving this need for cross-tenant and cross-region migrations is the merger and acquisition world. Paul and I today, we were joking, we were doing preparation for the webinar. We woke up today and there was another announcement of the Disney Fox merger. So every day we tend to wake up and we see these headlines all over the screen of all these merger and acquisitions. I know, for me, a typical day of learning about a large merger that was happening in the organization I worked for was, rolling out of bed in the morning and at 6 a.m. having that news alert in my face that the company was part of another large merger. And it was always funny. The first thing I would always ask is, I hope they're not running notes, and being the email person, that was always my major concern. So today we are going to be talking a lot about the challenges of doing cross-tenant migrations, and particularly these challenges in these large cross-region migrations. A lot of the merger and acquisition activity isn't just happening in single regions, it's happening all over the globe. And there's a lot of difficulties in doing that. Beyond just the technical side, there's also a lot of logistical challenges. So Paul and I today are really going to start talking about these. We hope you enjoy the series, the first part of the series today, and then we're going to have a second chapter of this, hopefully sometime in January. So my name is Mike Weaver. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I came from the industry doing mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures for large enterprise clients. Today I'm joined by Paul Robichaux. And let's see, Paul, can we hear you today? So Paul is a 15-time Microsoft Office Systems and Servers Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, and at Quadrotech is responsible for our product evangelism, communications, along with several other projects that we'll hear about in 2018. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to do the agenda.
Great, thank you, Mike, and thanks everybody for attending. So as Mike said, mergers and acquisitions are a huge part of the business environment today. We like to talk about and think about the big mega deals like Disney and 21st Century Fox, or CVS and Aetna. But the reality is that a lot of smaller organizations find themselves facing those same problems. So we're going to start with an overview of what we're specifically talking about in this part of the webinar. We'll have some follow-on parts that go into other parts of the merger, acquisition, and divestiture scenarios. We'll talk about some of the business dynamics that drive mergers and acquisitions, and that drive the technical work we have.
It sounds like Paul's having some audio challenges here. So we're going to talk about the dynamics of mergers and acquisitions. And so this, again, goes beyond just the technology, but a lot of the soft items here. Really what we're going to be talking about, is kind of this two-piece problem of the technology and the people behind it. We're then going to talk about 5 steps to merging. Paul's going to cover a really good chapter on, I think he calls it the five steps to heaven in doing these kind of things, and really the multiple steps and things that you have to think about here. And we'll finally wrap it up with some Q&A, and as well as when we talk about the 5 steps, the security implications in there as well. So let's see, Paul, do we have your audio back? So we're going to go a little bit out of order while we're getting Paul's audio back, and we're going to skip ahead to a section here. I'm sorry that we're having challenges. So when we talk about the business side of mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, really a lot of what we have to talk about is doing an inventory, a proper inventory. So one of the things that we use here at Quadrotech, and I'm going to go into this in another section, is our radar reporting product to help figure that out. But when we're talking about application inventory, it's really a two-piece process. It's really a application inventory of what users are using, but more importantly, it's mapping to them what are they going to use in the target. So when we talk about applications, it's more than just the collaboration tools, which, all of us kind of in the Microsoft space, that's kind of easy. User has email today, they're going to have email tomorrow, and just mapping things over. What really starts to get complicated is these CRM systems and databases. So we look at anything from the call, things like phone systems and call monitoring and routing. A lot of times the organizations merge, those don't match. When we talk about databases, it's very interesting. I always found this fascinating in the space is things as simple as access databases on people's, devices. You'd find that a lot of custom development had been done into those access databases and were really serving very critical functions for the organization. So, as you're doing this mapping, you have your strategic databases, which are usually pretty well documented, but you still have these kind of tactical database tools being used that can be very problematic. Again, we have the custom coded applications. These, again, are pretty well documented. However, one of the major challenges is a lot of times they have very unique challenges and prerequisites and things that come with it. So one of the things we really advise is when you're doing a look at the organization and doing an inventory of the applications, and tools like System Center, SCCM can help drive this, but really looking at what those end devices have, and that can kind of drive into the data inventory and those other pieces. When we talk about the data side, this can be easier in the sense of, the target, it's unstructured data. So the target's usually, if we're talking Office 365 to Office 365, we're talking about OneDrive to OneDrive, SharePoint to SharePoint, groups to groups, that kind of thing. But it can still get complicated is we still have to figure out if we're going to combine repositories. So, the common example I use is what do we do with two finance shares? So you have two finance departments coming together. Are you going to merge those two together? Or are you going to keep them separate when they come over? How is that going to run? Should the data come over at all? Public folders, we've really strive to give solutions to move public folders into shared mailboxes. But again, you're going to have the similar mapping problem where these organizations are coming together. Legal hold is a very big challenge. So when we talk through that, ensuring that those holds come over at the right time and together. What do you do with leaver data? What do you do with terminated employees? Is there do you need to keep that data for employees that are no longer with either organization, but may not be on legal hold? What regions are you in now? So we talk about these large multinational, multi-region acquisitions, doing an inventory of where these users are, how are they accessing things. So for example, if you acquire a company that has a North America tenant, but your company has all of their data out in Europe on the European tenants, that can be a very large challenge where suddenly all those users, we have to migrate that data across the pond, but the users have to do ongoing data access. Another challenge which we've learned a lot about lately is what's been shared externally. So the advantage of cloud is it's easy to share. You can, in OneDrive, we do this all the time with our clients where we'll just simply share out a folder in OneDrive or a piece of SharePoint, a web part in SharePoint or a document web part. This allows for really good collaboration, but if I'm going to move that data, should I automatically re-permission that data? Should I do that right away? Should I be auditing that? Should I be doing a review? These are all things that you have to consider. So Paul, do we have you back?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. All right, so I'm going to bring you back to your section here. Hopefully I didn't take too much of your thunder here.
No, not at all. So I'll try to talk fast while I have audio. When you think about M&A, it's really important to understand that there are many different types of M&A because there are some where two companies join forces, and there are others where one company swallows another one. That's the simplest way to think about it. And that initial dynamic drives what happens on the IT side. So as an example, if you look at Amazon versus Whole Foods, when Amazon bought Whole Foods, immediately from day one, they immediately started rip and replace. They told the Whole Foods IT guys, you're going to move off Azure onto AWS. We're going to replace internal systems. We're going to install Amazon hardware at Whole Foods locations. It was very clear who was driving that bus. On the other hand, if you look at Disney and Pixar, when Disney acquired Pixar, they made a pretty conscious decision to leave Pixar alone for the most part and to slowly integrate them into the Disney IT sphere without making a lot of drastic changes and upsetting any of Pixar's business flow. Microsoft is a great example because you all know what happens when Microsoft acquires somebody. They take over, they stamp everything with the Microsoft logo, and that's just the way it is. So throughout the rest of our presentation, both today and in the following sessions, we're going to assume that for the most part, if Company A and Company B are going through an M&A, that it's more of a single, it's more that the desired state is for them to have one shared environment. Not that they will continue to be separate and have federation, but that they will eventually end up in a common environment where they are both working out of the same tenant. Okay, Mike, if you can still hear me, next slide, please. Oh, good, you already did it. Cool. So from a business standpoint, right, we're all IT people, but the business problems that arise from M&A are things that sometimes have technical solutions and sometimes don't, but it's really important to be aware of them throughout the process. The first is good old-fashioned lack of communications. Very common problem across every domain where IT and business touch each other. For the most part, in these M&A scenarios, the business leaders are making a deal and the IT people find out about it after the deal has been agreed to in principle, and sometimes even after the deal's been done. So in some cases, the conversation that has to happen about joining those two households doesn't take place until after the paperwork's been signed, the executives have been paid, the SEC filings have been taken care of, and only then do the IT people get to sit down in a room and start talking. The next business problem with M&A is what I call the marriage problem. If you imagine that Alice and Bob are getting married, they have to make some decisions about what they're going to keep. They don't need 2 toasters. They don't need 4 TV sets. They probably, they have duplicate things in their households from living separately that they now have to reconcile in some way. This is exactly the same problem that every organization going through M&A has. From an Office 365 standpoint, you have to think about it in terms of the Office 365 tenant and licenses. There are a lot of other on-prem systems that come into play here, because if Company A is using ADFS for federation and Company B is using Ping, what is the merged organization going to use? If one company is using Kaspersky for desktop AV and the other company is using Malwarebytes, what are they going to end up with? So there are dozens, if not hundreds, of individual decisions that have to be made to make this merger go smoothly. From an Office 365 standpoint, one of the most interesting, most compelling problems that's the hardest to solve is when you think about M&A, where the companies or organizations that are merging or being acquired are in different geographies. Now, if they're all within the US or all within the EU, that's a relatively simple problem. Where you start to get into trouble and difficulty is when you've got different parts of the organization that are in different locations. Because then you have to make some decisions about where am I going to put data, what is the finalized environment going to look like based on regulatory and compliance restrictions that may be completely unfamiliar to one side of the business or the other. You see this all the time, for example, in pharma. Very common. The Swiss have got a booming pharma industry. And so there are often M&A transactions that involve a Swiss company being bought by or buying a US or UK company. Well, guess what happens then? Somebody has to make the decision about, okay, where are we going to home our data? Where are we going to home our intellectual property, even if it's not in the cloud yet? Because there are different IP laws, different reporting requirements, all sorts of differences that drive the decision about where you're going to put stuff in the merged household. Okay, my next slide, please. Now, those are the most obvious problems, but there are some other ones that are still important to think about too. One is that when you think about the migration process itself, again, you can compare this to two people getting married. You have to decide what you want to keep, what you want to archive, what you want to migrate, and what you can decommission or delete. You probably don't need 2 lawnmowers or 2 snow blowers. So the first problem is deciding which one to keep, but then you have to decide, what do you do with the other one? And before you get to the point of making that decision, you have to decide what actual data or resources you have in the first place. Mike is going to talk more about that in the inventory phase. That's one area where, for example, radar reporting can come in very handy. But there's definitely a tension between the business requirement to make the migration happen on a certain schedule and the technical requirements of inventorying the data you have, deciding what you have to do with it to stay compliant under whatever regulatory regime you find yourself, and then making it happen. Then we have the problem of policy mapping. Now, this is really a tough one because it goes far beyond the scope of just IT into the scope of business policy. So if you imagine 2 organizations, one's in Silicon Valley and one is in Germany, let's say, that are merging. They probably have completely different security policies. They probably have completely different policies about acceptable use. I guarantee you they will have different policies on whether or not employees are allowed to or required to use business systems during non-work hours. These are all policies. Somebody has to make a decision about which policy is going to apply to who in the merged organization. From an Office 365 standpoint, that can cover a bunch of policies that we didn't have to worry about a year ago, let's say. We now have client access control policies in Exchange Online. We have conditional access policies in Azure. We have Intune policies. For all of these different policy objects, somebody has to be responsible for deciding whether they will keep the policy from one side, the policy from the other side, or make a new policy. And again, from a business standpoint, somebody has to own the process of making those decisions and then drive the technical implementation of those policies. Then we have application mapping. Well, this is a familiar problem. Everybody understands this because we've all gone through the experience of joining a new company or changing jobs and finding out, okay, here are the systems that this company has. Some of them will be things that are familiar to you. Some of them are things that won't be. To some extent, we're insulated from this in the Office 365 world because if you're merging 2 companies that have already got Office 365, that covers you for the basic collaboration and communication workloads. But there can still be a whole bunch of other applications that are part of the ecosystem at one company or the other that integrate with Office 365 that you have to do something about. So for example, your service desk. If you're using Parature and I'm using ServiceNow, both of those plug into Office 365, but which one are we going to use? And how do we preserve ticket history? And how do we handle servicing in the mixed organization? What do we do about message hygiene, mobile device management? There are all these other IT systems that are there because there are business requirements for those capabilities that we have to figure out how to mix together. Okay, next slide, please. I really don't like talking about licensing because it's complicated and there are a lot of potential traps and pitfalls to fall into. But we have customers right now who are migrating in a big hurry because they were audited by Microsoft. Microsoft found out they didn't have enough licenses and said, you could buy all the on-prem licenses you need, or we will make you a special deal that is only good for 6 months if you migrate to the cloud. And we won't fine you or pursue any legal remedy against you for not having the right number of licenses. That's a business problem. There's no technology involved there. The technology problem comes in with being told that you have 6 months to migrate 90,000 users, right? That's a completely different set of technical problems we'll talk about later. But knowing what licenses you have on both sides versus what licenses you need to have is a critical requirement, because Microsoft will be happy to sell you many more licenses than you actually need. That's on you to figure out what you have to have and make sure that you're not overspending. Permissions and security. Now we start to find some interesting security related stuff to dig into. How do you know who has permission to do what? Well, it's pretty easy. If you get the people who are responsible for security and audit at company A, they should have a good idea and tools and data to back up that idea, to show what people in company A can do. But then there's company B. They should have that same data and knowledge also, but now you have to smash the two of them together, because you may have a team that has some people from A and some people from B who are working on a project that used to be owned by company A. Well, now how do you decide who should have permissions? How do you tell which permissions actually exist in that merged organization? How do you audit them? How do you manage them going forward? What do you do about people who leave? I mean, that kind of security and audit management is non-trivial, and failing to do a good job of it can have pretty significant consequences. Finally, we've got everybody's favorite topic, data sovereignty. This is really about 5 webinars all by itself, because it's a really rich, complicated topic. But the first thing to be aware of is that different jurisdictions have got different requirements for what you have to do with, or sorry, I shouldn't say what you have to do, what you may and may not do with data that you own. Now, it's really important to understand that, for example, in the EU, right now under the DPD and starting in May under GDPR, there's a wealth of data in your Office 365 tenant that you are responsible for safeguarding. Something as innocuous as a list of people who have bought your product in the last year will almost always contain data that must be protected under GDPR. So if you're a US company and you're merging with a company that's currently homed in the EU, guess what? Your US operation is going to be subject to that requirement also. This leads to jurisdiction shopping. So when people are trying to decide where they're going to deploy in a 2-into-1 scenario, very often they will pick the jurisdiction that they think will give them the least difficulty with data sovereignty. Really fascinating topic though, because there are countries where you're not allowed to host data remotely. Russia and Turkey being 2 examples. If you have business operations in those countries, all their customer data must be held locally. So you can't even use Office 365. Anyway, don't get me started. That's a topic for another time. Next slide, please, Mike. So with those business problems in mind, guess what? We still have a whole wheelbarrow full of technology problems that we have to deal with around this M&A activity. So let's start with something that everybody should understand, which is that hybrid is not an end point. It's an ongoing destination. It's an ongoing process. Microsoft likes to pretend like you can just set up hybrid just long enough to do your migration and move everybody over. But the fact of the matter is, almost every customer is going to want to keep some mailboxes, some file shares, some SharePoint servers on-prem for business reasons. Well, the minute you commit to keeping those artifacts on-prem, you're committing to an extended hybrid relationship. Now, keep in mind that in an organization where you've got A and B that are coming together, whether they stay in A's tenant or in B's tenant, or whether they create a new tenant C and move both A and B into that, that ongoing hybrid relationship still has to exist. It still has to be maintained. It still has to be secured. Identity management. Well, this is huge because it covers the whole spectrum from what happens when I onboard an employee, how does our user object get created, who secures it, who can see it, what services does it receive access to, how is it licensed, how is it synced, how do we federate, all the way up through the more exotic identity management topics that control things like conditional access to specific workloads. That's a whole smorgasbord of technology problems that have to be solved, either by unifying both organizations onto a single system, or more likely, figuring out how to take these two disparate systems and make them work as much like each other as possible to give users a consistent experience. SIEM, right? Security, event, and incident monitoring. This is really important because not having SIEM is essentially going naked in the street. You have no way to audit what's happening. You have no way to provide incident data when you discover an incident or a breach. That'll get you fined huge amounts under GDPR if you can't demonstrate exactly what has happened during a breach or potential breach. But just from a day-to-day security standpoint, it's critical that you have that. And again, you probably are going to find that each of your component parts already has a system in place for that now you have to unify. SMTP and addressing coexistence. You know, this is a pretty well understood problem because people have been merging SMTP namespaces as pretty much as long as there's been SMTP. So you've got users who have @contoso.com in their email address, and you're merging with another company, and so now you have some users who also have @fabricam.com. How do you handle that? How do you make sure that Fabricam users can email Contoso users, and so on? Office 365 does a pretty good job of handling that by itself, so that's not a huge problem, but it is something to be aware of. Data classification, labeling, and triage. So Swedish death cleaning is not actually a heavy metal band, although it could be one, but it refers to the very common Swedish practice of when people get to be late middle age. It's very common there for them to start going through their stuff and throwing things away, or in other words, decluttering, so that their kids will not have to, with the expectation that, okay, I'm in my 60s, let's say, I can probably throw out a bunch of crap now so that my kids don't have to go through it when I pass away. It's very pragmatic. I actually like the idea. But somebody has to do that with your data. That's a technology problem. If you have 5 terabytes of data in file shares, somebody has to go through and label and classify that data and decide what should be subject to retention. I mentioned earlier there's a business problem of making those decisions, right? The business problem is deciding, okay, all customer data we're going to keep for 7 years. Once the business has made that decision, now the poor technical people have to go through and figure out how to implement that. Mike can go on in great detail about how we do that for PST files, right, with PST Flight Deck, because one of the big problems we have with PSTs is, how do you know whose PST it is? When you find a file share that has this nest of PSTs in it, identifying who those belong to so that you can decide what needs to be done with them that's a pretty significant technical problem. We have a solution for it, but it's not trivial. Then finally, the catch-all for this type of situation is doing systems integration work. So I mentioned earlier the business implications of having line of business applications that are built on top of an on-prem system on one side that's now moving to Office 365 in the merged org. But message hygiene, multi-factor, fax, you'd be amazed at how many European and North American companies get into M&A relationships with companies that are based in the Pacific Rim and are horrified to find out how much business is still done in that part of the world via fax. It's a super common scenario, and it's a big pain, because if you have a system where you've got 50 lines on a fax server that are feeding into an on-prem Exchange server, and you're the Office 365 administrator in charge of merging that into your organization, you're going to be in for some fun times. Okay, next slide. So Mike earlier was talking about the 5 steps to heaven for a successful M&A operation. So far, I've spent some time outlining some of the problems and challenges that you're likely to face. But this 5-step process does a pretty good job of outlining a way for you to get from where you are now with A and B, with Alice and Bob, preparing to merge into a single organization. These steps will take you all the way through the sustainment or steady operations phase if you follow them. Now, obviously, because we're not consultants, we're not going to be able to tell you in this webinar exactly what to do in each of these steps for your organization. But this should be more than enough guidance to get you started thinking about the process and thinking about how to apply the overall process to your organization and your business and technical requirements.
Great. And so we did talk about inventory briefly while we had some audio issues. So actually, Paul, we're right back to desired state planning.
Okay, good. In that case, the key thing to remember about desired state planning is that this is a planning exercise. You don't do anything in this phase. Now, I guess I shouldn't say that. It's not strictly true, because you might do a small pilot or you might experiment with things, but this is not part of the migration. It's not a time when you should be moving users or creating conditional access policies. This is your opportunity to measure twice and cut once. So when you're in the desired state planning process, you should be thinking about one question above all. What should the final environment look like? You can almost think of this in some ways like designing your dream home. Imagine that you have an unlimited budget and you want to design the dream home, your forever home where you can live for the rest of your life. You can sit down and you can think, okay, where do I want it to be located? What do I want it to look like? What kind of amenities do I want it to have? Carpet or hardwood? Does it have a pool? Is it on the beach? Is it on top of a mountain? Does it have a helipad? That kind of exercise can be a lot of fun, but to bring it down to a little bit more practical level, what you're thinking about here are things like, if I've got an organization, if the merged organization has business operations in more than one nation, where do I want the tenant to be? Now, this may be driven by a requirement when two companies merge that you stick with using the tenant that one of them already has, but it may not be. And you may very well decide, I have been going through this process for a while with a local company here in Huntsville that has probably 20 or 30 subsidiaries in different countries that have all set up their own Office 365 tenants at various times. And now the hammer has come down from on high and the word has gone out to these subs that everybody has to be merged into the company tenant. And it's not an easy process. What security policies do you want the final environment to have? What version of desktop OS? What applications are you going to have? Now, I stuck that in there. It's a little bit of a tricky topic because oftentimes the people who are responsible for the Office 365 aspects of the merger are not responsible for desktop OS deployment and support. But it becomes very important when you think about what Microsoft's support policy is for desktop Office clients. So it may turn out that if you are responsible for implementing an M&A, that you end up getting stuck taking a break. Break's the wrong word. You may get stuck with a hole in your schedule while you have to wait for the desktop team to do some things before you can complete your migration. It's important that you understand that during this planning phase, that your schedule actually reflects any strategic pauses to do that kind of work. Which Office 365 workloads are people going to be using, and who's going to be using them? Does everybody have access to Forms or to Sway or to Planner? Do you have users in one country who are using Skype for meetings and in other countries are using Teams? We're going through this at Quadrotech right now. We have Skype deployed. We really want to use the new calling features that Microsoft just announced for Teams because those are being released. But because we have operations in 6 countries, 7, I forget how many, the only place where Microsoft is making those features available right now is US, UK, Canada, Belgium, and a couple others. Nothing in Slovakia, nothing in a couple of the other countries where we operate. So we're being forced to make some tough decisions right now about how we're going to deploy that functionality based on who can have access to it. Mike can talk about this in great detail. One of the biggest things to think about during planning is what data are you going to migrate from where to where? Okay, at the planning phase, that's the question you have to answer. Don't worry yet about how you're going to move it, but just think, okay, do I have PST files that I need to move? Do I have mailbox data that I need to move? Do I have data in SharePoint? Do I have data in OneDrive? Do I have data in Planner? This goes back to his discussion earlier about the inventory phase. Having a good inventory of what business data exists is super important. It's an absolute prerequisite before you can do good desired state planning, because one of the outputs of your desired state process should be nothing more than a list. It says, okay, data item A, files in Windows file servers. Here's what's going to happen to it. Data item B, files in users OneDrive for Business libraries. Here's what's going to happen to them. Then the last thing to think about, and this is as much a business desired state as it is a technical desired state. How will you know that the migration is a success? How will you know when it's done? Is it done when 100% of the users have been dir synced to the cloud and are in one tenant? Is it done when all the mailboxes are moved, but you still have on-prem file shares, or people are still having to log into multiple Office 365 accounts to access different SharePoint libraries? Is it done when every data item is moved into a unified tenant? I don't know, that's up to you, but you need to be thinking about that as part of this planning process. Okay, next slide, please. Keep in mind, like I said earlier, absolutely a planning process, not a time for you to jump in and, we used to joke about not unwrapping the shrink wrap on your Exchange Server software CD too early. And, that makes me sound old when I say it that way. But the same thing is true here. You shouldn't be deploying any servers or, running any PowerShell commandlets or anything during this phase. Because what's going to happen, as you go through this phase, you're going to come up with a comprehensive plan to address the questions that I talked about on the previous slide, plus some other ones that will come out as a result of you asking those high-level questions. You'll have a plan. You'll go through the pilot phase, which we're going to discuss in a minute, and that's going to drive adjustments in your plan. You might say, okay, you know what, great, we're going to leave everybody on Windows 10 and find that when you get to the actual mechanics of migrating people to OneDrive, you decide, wow, I really want Windows 10 Fall Creators Edition so that I get the Files on Demand feature for OneDrive. Well, guess what? Now you've had to adjust your plan as it regards what desktop OS you're going to require for people before you can move them. So it is always the case that your pilot will drive changes to the plan. And if you're smart and have budget and time to do it, you might even have a phased pilot where you build a plan, do a small pilot, adjust the plan, do another small pilot, adjust the plan again, do another small pilot, and keep doing that until everything goes flawlessly. Now, it's not always realistic to do that from a schedule perspective or a budget perspective, but ideally you would be able to iterate a couple of times over your plan to make sure it's really solid before you start moving large numbers of users. Next slide. Okay, cannot overemphasize this. The location of the tenant drives everything about Office 365 functionality, security, and compliance. I mentioned earlier, for example, that there are some features that are not available in some places. So if there's a particular Office 365 feature that you must have as part of your M&A, and I should back up a second too. One thing I didn't explicitly address, when we talk about M&A and Office 365, one very common scenario, company A is on-prem with Exchange, company B and the other workloads. Company B is on-prem with the workloads, and they decide to unify in a single Office 365 tenant and get rid of all their on-prem servers and devices. That's extremely common. So when I talk about the tenant location being the driver for all this functionality, maybe you already have a tenant, in which case, once a tenant location is set, you can't change it. But maybe you don't. If you have a choice about where your tenant location is, keep in mind that that choice is going to drive everything about the way Office 365 works for you. So features are tied to geos. Data sovereignty is a big deal. I mentioned that earlier. Microsoft has tried to address this in a couple of ways. So they finally, at Ignite, announced that they would be providing multi-region support for Exchange Online. Now, the reason that they did this is essentially for sovereignty, not for performance. It's extremely expensive. There are some limitations to the way it's implemented, and they don't yet have multi-region for any other workloads besides Exchange. So I've had customers and potential customers who said, oh, well, we're not worried about how we're going to handle our M&A because Microsoft is going to support multi-region and we'll just have one tenant in each region and everything will be great. No. Maybe someday they'll get there, but they're not there yet. Seek professional help. I cannot overemphasize this either. Migrations are almost like having, I don't know, knee surgery or some other, maybe knee surgery is not the best example, but you only are going to migrate once. And for most people during their career, they may do no more than 2 or 3 migrations. Right? It's not a common operation that you'll have the opportunity to do a lot unless you're a migration consultant. It's well worth your time and well worth your money to get people who are experienced in this area and have them help you to keep you from potentially making an expensive mistake. Now, I don't have time to go through the full case study, but I'll mention an example of a customer that I worked with when I was a migration consultant. A US-based heavy manufacturing company. They make locomotives. They have about 6,000 employees worldwide, roughly half in the US, a quarter in Brazil, and a quarter in Germany. So when they wanted to move to Office 365, they had some pretty significant problems because their German employees are subject to German labor law, which has some specific data protection and access and security implications. They're subject to EU data protection requirements. They will now be subject to GDPR. And guess what? Brazil has a completely different set of labor regulations and compliance regulations for financial reporting and security. And both of those regulations are both more restrictive and very different than the regulations that apply in the US. So they really only had one choice at the time that we migrated them. They ended up with a tenant in Germany for all their German employees, a tenant in the US for their US employees, and a tenant in Brazil for their Brazilian employees. So that was the best that they could do at that time because of Microsoft's product offerings. Now that Microsoft is moving toward giving, allowing people to build environments that cross a little better, now they're going to have to go back and do a merger to merge all those into the same org, which is probably not going to be a lot of fun for them. Next slide, please.
So as Paul and I talked through, everything that's going on here, really build out becomes a second part. So planning is obviously with any project, the most important thing you can do, and everything we've kind of talked up to this point is that planning. But when you talk about build out, we really need to talk about how fast do you want your project to go and how fast you can go. I think what's interesting, and I think Paul, you've had similar experiences in your projects, is from a technology standpoint, yes, we have these limitations, particularly when we're doing cross regions where, speed and really isn't even speed, it's latency, right? The latency between these regions is high, and we have these massive data cables that have been put in our oceans to allow for these very wide pipes, but latency is still a major problem. But even outside of technology, I still subscribe that the largest consideration in how fast you can go is how much user impact your organization can handle at a time, and really the help desk impact that's there. And a lot of organizations really underestimate the impact that this has to user productivity, but also to your help desk and the cost and expense that goes into it. When we're kind of in these closed door meetings doing estimates, pre-close on what it's going to cost to actually integrate these organizations, a lot of the cost estimates fail to take these pieces into account. And that's even the most mature organizations where these costs are still missed and absorbed in other areas. So when you're asking about how fast you want to go, yes, data volume is very important, but this piece is even more important, because if you're going to move 1,000 people a weekend and do that, you really need to, in your pilot phase, which we're going to talk about in here too, you really need to understand what your help desk volume is going to be, and are you ready for that? And are your users ready for a 2, 3, 4 hour delay come Monday morning? And how impactful is that going to be to the customers that you serve? So again, we talked about source and target locations being in multiple regions. That's extremely important. And we also need to look at the health of getting them in. We talk about the data migration, but another item that you have to keep in mind is this data is typically cache, especially in the cloud world. OneDrive, cache, Exchange cache. this data has to come back down. So one of the problems that we see is some of these offices don't plan for that. So you have organizations that have their internet pipes get completely saturated. So you have the kind of the horrible scenario, right? Your users are on a long help desk line. The devices are downloading too much data at once, and nobody can do any work in the entire location that you did. And we're going to talk also today briefly about, do you go by office or go by department? One of the things that I can't stress enough is if you have QoS or quality of service, if you don't have that enabled on your network pipes, really getting it enabled for these projects so that you can keep things like your voice traffic, voice over IP traffic still running. It really is difficult when you can have this data problem, but our phones are all voice over IP now. If you can't even make a phone call, or you're dropping all your help desk calls because QoS isn't involved, implemented, it really can be a problem. So when we talk about pilot, one of the biggest things is investigating what users are doing. One of my best experiences that I learned from industry in doing merger and acquisition is I would go to the company that we acquired and I would sit down with people and watch them work. I would sit down with a customer service representative and watch them and work with them for an hour and watch how they took calls and ensure that when I'm looking at my SCCM report from those devices, that everything matches up. And almost every time we found at least two things. One of them, Paul mentioned earlier, was fax. And so to reiterate that, fax is always a wild card in these projects, and you really need to account for that and map that through. The other thing was just you'd find odd business practices, that there might be better ways to do it, or just little things, little Outlook plugins, little Flash plugins, things like that these representatives were using, and that may not work on the target build. Communication planning. You want your communications team part of the planning and the pilot, and also part of the remediation from the pilot to ensure that that is effective. And the communication plans, can be, again, it depends on the theory on how you're doing your migration, but really getting them to do the system-wide communications and then doing the targeted communications on what you need. Diverse pilot groups. Doing a pilot on a specific set of users is good when you're doing your first couple pilots, but you have to do a large diverse pilot group at some point before moving to production. This is where you're going to find your data. So this is where you're going to find the information and everything that you need to drive the rest of the project. And above all, we put automation workflows into all of our products when we're doing M&A work. Ensure you document all automation opportunities. Look at your help desk logs. What's coming in? Is anything that we could put in a PowerShell script and put it into a workflow engine and implement it and prevent it from happening? Is there an SCCM modification that we can make to a job? Things like that. Anything that can be solved through automation, you really want to put in so that it can scale up. We're starting to run a little bit out of time here, so I'm just going to breeze over this one here on who do you go to and roll out, and it's by office or by department. And this is a difficult decision, and the answer here is not you must go by office or you must go by a department. It really is an organization by organization choice. What's nice when you go by office is you can kind of put your SEAL teams on the ground, ensure that you've got people there to support. So that kind of helps with your help desk problem because you have people and runners all in the same place. But sometimes bandwidth can't handle that. And it can really cause some problems, particularly when you have a lot of latency between the site and the actual location of the tenant. This can be very problematic. Training, communications, there's advantages to both. You can do a lot more remote sessions, or you have to do these big in-person sessions, or you can do a hybrid of both, but that's where those advantages are. So Paul, if you don't mind, I'm going to skip over this slide and go to the next one just so we have enough time for question and answer here.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody knows what sustainment is like anyway, because that's what we do every day. It's just you're doing it in an merged environment.
Yep. And the last thing we're just going to talk about, I am a big fan of data, and I think everyone is in making these. My favorite thing right now when I'm doing merger acquisition and divestiture planning for an organization is using our Radar product to get the data. We're launching a series of reports, and Cloud Commander is our tenant-to-tenant product. So this is just a quick screenshot of the reports that we're specifically putting in Radar to help do this. This is only the first three. We're drastically enhancing this. Today, I actually do it manually in Radar. I have a bunch of custom reports that I create. But I have customers that come in and all we need is a read-only service account, and we can immediately inventory that source tenant. And there's one project, it was only about 2,000 users, and once they set up Radar, after the data collection was done, within one day I was able to come back with them, give them a total inventory of their infrastructure, applications, or Microsoft stack, and give them a migration plan. It's extremely powerful. Those of us who have been doing this for a while, one of the largest problems is getting good data. Oftentimes when we acquire a company, the other side is really, really taxed. They're overloaded and they're stressed, and the unknown of what's going on in the business environment added on, who is authorized to give this information, and all these other things that go through people's heads can mean it can take months to get this data. Whereas now, just asking for, I need a read-only service account with this right, I can immediately get this data and immediately come back with a plan so that we can support the people that are in the acquired firm and help get the project moving faster and take that stress off of them. So that's all we have for now. Let's see if we have any questions here. So we do have one question here. One is what products do you have to solve this problem? So the answer there on the migration side is, so we talked about Radar reporting being the reporting arm, and that's certainly something we're really bringing, and that's going to drive our other migration products. The main products for this space is Quadrotech Cloud Commander, which we use for migrating live mailboxes, and with OneDrive support coming out in the next couple weeks here, and that's going to continue to expand. We also have a public folder shuttle, which is a public folder transformation product, which will scan the public folder environment, identify those workloads and where they begin, where they end, and then mapping them to a proper target. And then we have our other on-premise solutions. We have Archive Shuttle for our archive migration product for things like Veritas Enterprise Vault. We have PSD Flight Deck that Paul mentioned earlier, which is our PSD upgrade process. And we got another question in here. How do you handle the problem where an SMTP domain can only be in one domain, one tenant at a time? And that answer is we support two options. One is we can help manipulate the Active Directory object to make it a mail user to help move that domain over or help redirect mail. But the user, when they move over, and for those that are interested, we can talk afterwards. The SMTP domain can only be in one tenant at a time in the email space. So the organization either needs to take on the branding or the SMTP domain of the company that bought them, or they need a similarly named domain name. So for example, instead of contoso.com, it can be contoso.uk or contoso.us.com, things like that. And that becomes the user's sending email address until the project's done. You can revert back, and then the mail is redirected on that old SMTP address into the new tenant, and eventually that SMTP domain can be swung over. The other option is to subscribe to a message rewrite service for your message cleansing vendor. Usually people are using Exchange Online protection today, so sometimes you have to add another one into the mix in order to get that message rewrite. And that's where users are in a table of what their outgoing email address should be and what their internal routing email address is, and the header is rewritten. Certainly take caution with that. If it is a mandate that you have, it is kind of your only option, but it is a service that is modifying your headers and does enter a level of single point of failure in your environment. So that's all the time we have questions for. Paul, any last thoughts before we end today?
No, I just want to remind everybody that we have part 2 of this coming up. We haven't announced a firm date for it yet, but we're going to be talking about some of these same concerns or same concepts as it regards divestitures. When you have two companies, or sorry, you have a company that's spinning off a business unit or removing part of the organization. It's not just the same thing. It's not the same process in reverse. That's part of what makes it so interesting. So we'll do that in part 2. And then in part 3, we're going to go deeper into some of the security aspects underlying M&As with policy management and reporting and auditing that we touched on here. So however you found out about this webcast, keep your eye on those same channels, and you'll see announcements for the other 2 parts coming up in the near future.
Great. Thanks, Paul. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we look forward to talking to you on our other webcasts. If there's anything today that you have questions on that we couldn't answer or anything else you want to go on, go ahead and use the Contact Us feature on our webpage. Paul and I would love to get back to you on, more than willing to set up some calls too if we kind of hit a nerve on something. Have a great day. Thank you.